I recently worked with an athlete who had elbow pain when releasing the ball and dropped his slot by a little over a foot. Pain went away, and I thought this was the perfect case study to dive into the weeds of biomechanics, elbow pain, and how all of this is intertwined together. So, this is going to be the ultimate deep dive into elbow pain, elbow anatomy, pain itself, throwing, arm stresses, torques, all that kind of stuff. So, we'll go over a lot of stuff. Some stuff we'll go over pretty briefly. Some stuff we'll dive into pretty deep. So here's what I got on this case study here. Starting with the medial elbow anatomy, we've got the humerus bone, the ulna bone, and the radius bone. The humerus bone is going to be the upper arm. Ulna is going to be the main forearm bone. Radius is going to be the thumb side, smaller forearm bone. Doesn't connect into the humerus, connects right into the ulna at the radial-ulnar joint. Here you have the ulnar-humeral joint where the UCL is. This is the inside of the elbow that is going to be the primary stressed tissue of the throw. This is what's replaced in a Tommy John surgery. And you have the medial epicondyle, which is where the end of the humerus is here. And that is where the UCL is going to attach to at the humerus. So UCL here. And then these are going to be some of the muscles of the forearm that are going to be stabilizing the inner elbow here as we go into layback, stretching this UCL. That's where some of these forearm muscles are going to help to stabilize. So we have the pronator teres, which is going to be responsible for going thumb down like this, and that's going to be the primary motion through ball release here. Palmaris longus is a muscle that not everyone has. About 10 to 15% of the population is not going to have one. It is also the tendon that is used from the distal side at the forearm here where it connects, and that is going to be used in Tommy John surgeries in most cases to replace the UCL, where the graft comes in here, drill holes through each side of the bone, put the palmaris longus tendon in. In cases where they don't have it, they'll have to use the hamstring tendon instead of the palmaris. But I think the palmaris is definitely worth noting here as it is a noticeable muscle here, and it crosses at the UCL, and it's going to help to provide some stabilization and act within wrist flexion. Another big muscle here is the FCU, the flexor carpi ulnaris, which is going to do ulnar deviation. This motion here, and that is going to be one of the biggest muscles for kind of covering this UCL and providing some stabilization to the joint. Next one we have here is the flexor digitorum superficialis, the FDS muscle. And this muscle is going to be connecting to the middle of the knuckles here. And that's one of the primary finger flexor muscles that's going to be stressed and strained during the throw, along with providing this stabilization for the elbow. Not noted on this picture here is the FDP muscle. FDP is going to connect to the fingertips instead of the mid finger here. So both of those are going to be very important for providing some stability, protecting this UCL, as we kind of discuss the difference between varus valgus and get into some of the elbow stress metrics. So valgus load. This is going to be what actually stresses the UCL and the medial elbow structures here. This is the UCL where we were covering the gap between the humerus and the ulna. So a normal elbow is going to look like this. One that is excessive cubital valgus, which is going to be the UCL is stretched out and we are opening up the inside of the joint here and compressing the radio-ulnar side of the elbow here on the outside. So this is ulnar-humeral gapping, and one of the strongest correlations we have using an MRI or even an ultrasound to predict future injuries, as excessive gapping of the inside of the elbow is going to, one, create a length of the UCL itself and stretching at rest. So once we go from a normal carrying valgus angle here into further valgus as we go into layback, that's going to further stretch the UCL beyond what it's prepared for, along with the forearm structures that are going to be stabilizing the inside of the elbow joint here. So those are going to be at length, and they're going to be much weaker at end range length compared to a normal valgus here, where they are covering a smaller distance. They're more in a mid-range and a much stronger range as well. So going from valgus to varus, valgus is going to be the actual load that's placed onto the medial elbow, but to resist the load, the internal structures are going to have to create the varus moment to overcome the valgus so the elbow doesn't blow up. So the moment is going to be the physics definition where we take the force times the distance. So I have a simple example here using elbow flexion. So when we are at full elbow extension, the distance is going to be 0. So no matter what the force is, anything times 0 is going to be 0. Torque is always going to be 0 here. When we are at our longest distance right here, which is going to be at 90 degrees of elbow flexion, which is roughly what the layback position is going to be. This is going to be the highest possible Newton meters of torque that we can create just with the distance itself. So all forces being equivalent forces of gravity here is the distance times the force. Distance is longer, force is the same. This is how we get up to 6 Newton meters of torque. Well, this is not going to be torque that's produced on the medial elbow. This is not going to be specifically valgus loading to create varus moment, but this is a simple definition for you to conceptualize what is being discussed and what the underlying metrics for actually calculating the torque components are going to be. So torque is in Newton meters, so newtons of force times meters of distance, multiply them together, Newton meters. So here's a graph to kind of visualize. We have the peak of torque right here where we are at the 6.6 Newton meters of torque. At 0 degrees of distance, we have 0 degrees of torque, or 0 Newton meters of torque. Full flexion, well, we're not getting all the way up to 0 degrees. We come a little bit closer than we are at 90 degrees. So we're going to drop this torque, say, roughly around 3 Newton meters here. So the varus resultant is just going to be all of the force required to overcome the valgus. And when we have layback, distance, and the speed as well, the speed is going to increase the force going into that end range position. So the varus moment is going to be peaking right before maximum external rotation of the shoulder joint, because if we think about the speed, which is going to be creating this force here, if we have no speed like we do at the end range and we go from going back to going forward, there's going to be the time where we are completely stopped. So it is going to be much lower force with lower speed. So as we are going back and externally rotating with higher force, the moment is going to be higher because the distance is going to be same with higher peak force, higher varus moment. So as we'll go into a little bit later, we'll discuss this a little bit more in depth, but that's going to be kind of a brief introduction to varus moments, valgus loading, all that kind of stuff of the medial elbow. Some of the other stresses that we will discuss that are equally important is going to be torque, not of the medial elbow, but of shoulder internal rotation as we go into ball release. There's going to be short torque created at the shoulder joint as well. And then distraction forces that are pulling joints apart together, because as we extend with velocity, the joints are going to be separating both at the elbow and the shoulder again. So we need these forearm muscles that we had talked about earlier to hold the joint together to stabilize, and that's going to prevent the only-humeral gapping where we create the carrying valgus angle of the elbow. And similarly to the shoulder joint as well, we're going to need the rotator cuff and posterior shoulder muscles all to help to stabilize that joint and pull it together to oppose the forces of the elbow being pulled apart. So introducing some of the concepts that we are going to discuss when we actually talk about pain and compensation is going to be first the joint by joint theory. So this is going to state that each joint is going to be alternating from demands of high mobility to high stability. So the toes are going to be a mobile joint. You can move your toes similar to how you can move your fingers a lot. But the metatarsals in like your hand here, those are very stable. You can't move the inside of your hand here. Your wrist is then going to be mobile. Elbow is going to be stable. You can't move your elbow around a ton. But the shoulder is going to be a mobile joint. So as we go joint by joint here, we see how some of these insufficiencies where if you have reduced shoulder mobility, such as internal rotation that's required to go into ball release and protect that shoulder, that's going to lead to higher elbow mobility, which is going to be the only humeral gapping in the carrying valgus angle, as we do not want those because the elbow is supposed to be a stable joint. So if we turn the elbow from a stable into a mobile joint, that's where issues are going to occur. And there's not enough stability to ensure that everything is kept tight, stable, and going to be both pain-free and safe on all those localized structures of the medial elbow. So we're going to combine the joint by joint theory with the expansion compression theory, which is popularized by Dr. Bill Hartman, as a physical therapist. And this is going to state how everything in the body is going to be biasing either internal or external rotation. So we have wide versus narrow athletes. We have terrestrial versus aerial athletes. We have inhalation versus exhalation bias. And all of these things are going to be creating torque and differences of pressure in the body. So when we look at this graphic created by Zach Couples from his Instagram page, we have how inner elbow pain is going to be symptomatic with external rotation of both the wrist and the glenohumeral joint here at the shoulder, while outer elbow pain, which is common in tennis elbow, is going to be internal rotation of the wrist and the shoulder here. So if we look at these other structures, and this is a common adaptation for baseball pitchers here, is to develop this external rotation of the shoulder to aid in some of this layback, as we'll get into how layback is very beneficial not only for performance, but also for arm health, which is much less known compared to the performance enhancing benefits of layback. So in a similar but opposite manner, a lot of tennis players are going to develop excess internal rotation of the wrist and the shoulder from rotating over with a lot of their hits back and forth at high volume. So taking each of these theories, we're going to introduce the case study that we're working with here. So we have motion capture on a pitcher who had thrown the same velocity at two different release heights, which you see here, the 5.3 versus 4.1 release heights on a motion capture process with Thea. So there's going to be a lower release height, higher release side, and arm angle is going to be 20 degrees lower in this pain-free slot. So this will be the basis of what we're going to be working with throughout this case study here, is albeit only 6 pitches, 3 at a high slot that are painful, 3 at a low slot that are pain-free. Same velocity, just 0.5 miles per hour away, which gives us a great comparison when we're trying to equate for the effects of velocity, which velocity is going to lead to higher stress in and of itself. However, we're able to almost negate that entirely with the velocity differential here. With that being said, though, this is N of 3 pitches on each side and N of 1 for the athlete itself, just a case study of one athlete. So we're going to dive in as deep as we can, make a lot of interesting observations, try to see what the data is showing us here, try to make some conclusions. However, these conclusions are going to be made with a grain of salt. You can't take one pitcher throwing 6 pitches and apply that to everyone in the whole world. Obviously, that makes no sense, but with that being said, we'll still dive into this, and it's going to give us a very interesting baseline. That'll be kind of something you can keep in the back of your head when looking at other athletes and working with guys in the future. So when we compare some of these stresses that we had talked about, these are going to be the 4 main stresses that are discussed in pitchers, which is going to be torque of both the inner elbow and the shoulder, as well as these distraction forces pulling the joints apart. So we have distraction forces almost entirely the same, where the pain-free throws were 1% higher in each of the distraction forces. So almost entirely equal here. There's nothing of note. When comparing the varus torque, this is definitely a substantial difference of just over 10% difference of increased varus torque of the high slot pitches here. However, the pain that the pitcher was experiencing is coming at ball release. So I wanted to dive in a little bit more into what specifically is creating the pain at ball release. If the only difference is varus torque, why is this not shown with some of the other metrics such as distraction forces? And similarly, there's a significantly higher shoulder torque in the pain-free pitches. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper here into some of these underlying metrics that are talked about much less frequently, and why specifically this pitcher is having pain at ball release if the only difference here is going to be torque. So I was assuming that there's going to be a little bit more under the hood that we can dive into and kind of get a better explanation of why exactly this is happening, opposed to just, okay, his varus torque is higher, 14 nanometers higher, 10% difference. Okay, that's why, which that's absolutely a huge factor here. But if the pain is at a completely different point, comparing where we discussed the maximum varus torque is going to be just prior to maximum external rotation compared to the pain at ball release, that's a huge window within the throw itself. So that's why we're going to be diving a little bit deeper here. So the first thing that I used to create this analysis was using Driveline's Open Biomechanics project to look at what creates torque in and of itself. So we discussed how torque is force divided by distance. So with distance being the same, we then have to equate for velocity, because if we fail to equate for velocity, we know that throwing hard is going to be increasing stress on the elbow with this varus moment torque, because there's going to be a higher total force here. So we have to equate for what's going to be increasing the elbow varus moment per mile per hour. And that's where we're going to be discussing a lot of these interesting metrics here, where I have sorted these out by non-energy versus energy metrics. So a lot of these top metrics here are going to be just how much energy is being sent from throughout the thorax, throughout the shoulder, elbow, how much is generated in the elbow. And these are all going to explain at least 10% of the difference in elbow varus moment per mile per hour, compared to some of these other metrics such as maximum shoulder external rotation, shoulder abduction at foot plant, maximum elbow extension velocity, which are going to be a significantly lower portion of the variance explained in what's actually creating this torque. And as we discussed a little bit earlier, it's very interesting to note here how there is a inverse correlation between maximum shoulder external rotation and elbow varus moment per mile per hour. So the R squared of 0.16 is going to be in the negative direction. So as a pitcher opens shoulder external rotation, increases their layback throughout the throw, this is going to give them a longer buffer, give them a longer runway to think, where they can decelerate over a longer time. So the force that's being produced to create this peak torque moment is going to be lower. So this is something that may be shielding the elbow in a sense that we'll dive a little bit into more here. But that was a very interesting finding that I found throughout my initial deep dive here. So continuing some of these energy flow metrics, since this is going to be the highest predictor of some of the varus torque per mile per hour. So energy is going to be power divided by time. So it takes the peak power that you would see on a counter movement jump or anything that's instantaneously, and it takes that multiplied by the amount of time that the power is being produced from. So this is going to give you the cumulative energy that's sent throughout the segment here, whether we're talking about the thorax, shoulder, or the elbow. So the primary factor for increasing varus torque per mile per hour is going to be each of these ones here. And we note how these initial two metrics are almost going to be null here as well, where there's going to be a very slightly higher, only 3 joules of energy more from the higher slot, 6 joules of energy less from the higher slot in the shoulder, which are each going to cancel out. These are almost negligible here, with the difference of 6 joules being so small. So the elbow transfer is where we see a little bit more of a jump here, but we're still only looking at 5 joules total, where if we think 5 joules right here, it's nothing. Just because the elbow is transferring a little bit less, this number is going to look a little bit higher. So it's something to note, but this is also going to be interesting because these are in the negative direction. So these are not this is not energy transferred from the upper arm through the elbow this way, but it's the other way around, which is very interesting and something I'm not too familiar with on why exactly this is occurring, and going to have to continue to dive a little bit more into. But these are the kind of initial findings with these energy flow metrics here. With the high slot here, very interesting how the elbow was refusing to generate any of its own energy compared to in the low slot throws. Again, a similar difference here where we're continuously around this 6 joules of energy mark, which is still incredibly low despite the obvious separation in delta percentiles, but there's still a 6 joule of energy difference. So the elbow generation, I believe, is going to be a limitation of the brain refusing to generate more energy while knowing it is about to run into something that's going to perceive to be dangerous and painful. So it's going to sort of shut down the actual production of energy it creates throughout the throw, compared to the low slot throws where there's not going to be the similar inhibition from the nervous system in the brain shutting this down. So we're able to send an additional 6 joules of energy through this elbow that's created locally. As we continue diving into some of these other metrics that are going to be explaining some variance in elbow torque per mile per hour, we have the elbow extension velocity, which is again showing us the inverse of what we'd expect based on this 140 newton meters of torque compared to 126 that we saw in the introduction. So it's 11% less of the elbow extension velocity in the high slot and painful throws, which you wouldn't expect compared to this chart that we're looking at. Similarly, in the shoulder internal rotation velocity here, not much of a difference at all. Max layback, there's the inverse correlation here, where it does show a little bit of what we were seeing before, but again, a 1% difference, just 3 degrees here. This is not going to be much of a true determination. Shoulder abduction at foot plant is something I highlighted here just to show, again, that there's a significant difference of 11%, but these are going to be reminiscent of the actual slot change itself, where the torso position is going to be in more flexion with the lower slot, which is going to allow the elbow to climb up higher, creating this drastic difference where it's something that we're definitely going to highlight and keep note of. However, without a large sample size to corroborate this finding on, I don't believe that's something I'm going to put excessive amounts of weight in at this point right here in the analysis. So we're going to continue diving a little bit deeper into the process of how some of these metrics are created. So looking at some of the open biomechanics percentiles of each of these metrics to just kind of conceptualize what we're looking at here. The pitch velocity is obviously going to be in the 70s, so it's very hard to get much of true value with such low velocity pitches. And some of these energy transfer metrics at 0 percentile, which is going to be very interesting. Huge spike in this 6 joules of energy versus 0.01 of elbow generation in energy here. So that's going to be definitely something that we have of note right here compared to some of these other metrics where we continue seeing almost no significant differences. Again, we have the shoulder abduction at foot plant, but this, as we said, is going to be more reminiscent of the slot itself compared to actually looking at what is causing the pain and what are the differences in the throw and the stresses on the arm. So as we dive deeper than just these peak torque metrics and looking at how they're created, we have these graphs right here looking at the elbow distraction forces along with the peak varus torque. So as we talked a little bit earlier in the throw, we have the time in milliseconds with the events of maximum external rotation and ball release here. And we can see how in both these throws, the peak varus torque is going to be timed up at a very similar moment. But in both of them, these are going to be occurring before maximum external rotation, where we have the combination of high speed going into layback combined with the same distance that we're at here. So the velocity is going to be slowing down while the distance is going to be staying the same, which is going to lead to this much higher torque that we're seeing at the moment prior to ball release. Similarly with the elbow distraction metrics that we're looking at and how much force is produced that pulls the elbows apart, these are going to be concentrated much more heavily in the high slot throws. The low slot throws, there's this one throw right here, throw number 6. It looks like where there's higher elbow distraction forces that are occurring just after ball release itself. Yet for the most part, these are all going to be occurring right around the same part. So there's not much to take away here that's going to give us too much insight. So I will continue diving a little bit deeper into this now. So as we start to dive truly under the hood, we have the scapular protraction, which as we discussed with maximum external rotation, increasing the degrees of layback going into the shoulder is going to give the shoulder a longer runway to decelerate. I hypothesize that this would be a similar mechanism that's used with the scapula. So I was pulling the shoulder excursion from both foot plant to ball release and ball release to the end of the throw. So excursion is just going to be the total distance traveled, the total range of motion, arc, whatever you want to call it. So these are going to be created in a similar total range, but different method of getting there. Where the low slot throws, we're getting the shoulder to protract and we're getting more shoulder abduction throughout the earlier parts of the throw as we go from foot plant and we're landing into ball release, compared to in the high slot throws where we're not getting much of this until ball release happens, and then we're getting a long deceleration here. So this is going to be one of our first interesting findings when we look at what's actually causing the pain of ball release. Because if we have a longer total runway here until ball release, which is when the pain is actually going to be occurring, at the low slot throws, we have a longer runway. So it's 8% less of a runway and 8% less range of motion that we have to decelerate and absorb these stresses for. Another metric I've highlighted here is going to be the shoulder horizontal abduction, which is going to be where in space the arm is at ball release. Significant difference. Yet again, this is going to be something that's going to be more so reminiscent of the slot itself compared to the actual stresses of the throw. So the next one that I have highlighted here that is very interesting is the shoulder horizontal abduction deceleration. So deceleration is going to be the rate of change of the peak velocity. So we're going to be taking the derivative of the peak velocity. So that's how you get the degrees per second or degrees per second squared. And the peak shoulder abduction deceleration, so the rate of change is going to be significantly higher, 11% higher in the high slot compared to the low slot throws here. So what this is saying is that the high slot throws, the shoulder is going to be slamming on the brakes at a much faster rate compared to in the low slot throws, where it's going to be almost rolling through and giving us a longer duration of deceleration compared to the top throw, where it's more similar to hitting a brick wall and just stopping immediately compared to hitting something soft and decelerating a little bit slower. So expanding on the peak deceleration of shoulder horizontal abduction, which is just going to be the scapula using a proxy of the humerus here. So how fast the humerus is stopping this way is what we were just looking at. So we have the peak shoulder internal rotation, peak elbow extension, peak pronation, peak deceleration of all of these. So again, this is going to be the derivative, which is the rate of change, the how fast it's hitting the wall and stopping, and that's what we're going to be looking at here. So we have a 12% difference in higher shoulder internal rotation, peak deceleration with the high slot, but then it flips with the low slot in the pain-free pitches. We have 33% less elbow extension deceleration and 46.6% less peak pronation deceleration, which is the exact opposite and the contrary to what you would expect, or at least what I had expected when first diving into this. But as I dive more into this and compare it to the impulse graph right here, I think it does make a lot more sense, as the structures of the elbow and the tendons, the muscles, the UCL itself, the joint structure, the integrity, they don't know the peak moment. They don't know the peak torque values or any of this stuff. What they just know is the cumulative load. So when we have these very sharp impulse graphs like we do with the shoulder horizontal abduction at the shoulder internal rotation, the shoulder is doing significantly less work right here. It's hitting the wall, stopping, and it's unwilling to accept a lot of this energy, I believe, which is going to force a lot more of this energy to go down to the elbow with elbow extension and pronation. So there's going to be a flatter impulse curve with lower peak deceleration in the painful pitches at the high slot, which is going to open up this area underneath the curve, because even though the peak is higher, this graph's going to be exaggerated compared to like what we're actually looking at here. However, the flatter impulse curve at the shoulder with the low slot pitches is going to be a lower peak, but it's going to be doing more total work, which is going to prevent the elbow from having to do that work that it's unprepared to do, and it's structurally insufficient to handle. So when we dive into this, and we're now able to explain that the shoulder is doing so much more in these low slot pitches, so the elbow doesn't have to do as much. And this is one of the biggest primary findings that we've come to so far throughout this analysis. So as we look into some of these metrics on saving the elbow, one of these metrics that I really liked looking into is the shoulder IR deceleration duration, full width of half moment. So when we look at the impulse graph from this last slide here, so we have the peak moment right here. But when we describe this metric of full width of the half moment, so whatever half of the peak moment is, so A, it's going to be about right here. The full width is going to be 50% force, 100% of the time it's at 50% or higher. For B right here, this is 100% of the peak force. We'll say this is about 50% right here, and then 100% of the time. But again, like we said, how the elbow itself, no structure, just knows the peak force. They also don't know just time. So the FWHM is a great initial metric to start looking into this, but it's still not going to tell the whole story. So we're going to continue diving a little bit deeper. But as we are here and as we're looking at some of these metrics to kind of explain more about this impulse graph that we're looking at, the shoulder IR deceleration, so how long the shoulder is spending to decelerate, we have 48 milliseconds versus 57 milliseconds in the low slot. So we have an extra 9 milliseconds or 16% less time decelerating at the shoulder in these high slot throws, which is going to be less time that we're able to continue doing work and continue absorbing force for. So if we look at now at the shoulder decel duration, peak to zero. So from when we peak, the peak velocity of shoulder internal rotation, so say it's right here, all the way until we first hit zero, how long does that take? How long are we truly continuing to absorb these forces for? And with the high slot and the painful throws, we have 30 milliseconds compared to 37 milliseconds in the low slot throws. So we have this extra 7 milliseconds again, 17% less duration that this deceleration is occurring for. So when we now compare the shoulder divided by the energy absorption from the ball release to the end, So how much energy is the elbow versus the shoulder actually willing to absorb in deceleration from the ball release to the end of the throw? We have 9.3x the shoulder to elbow here compared to 11.95. So when we have the ratio of shoulder divided by elbow, the shoulder is doing 22.2% less work as a ratio of shoulder to elbow in these high slot painful throws compared to the elbow, which is exactly what is happening in this throw and exactly the underlying metrics that we're kind of looking to unveil and find out to describe why this pain is happening here. So in these low slot pain-free throws, the shoulder is doing significantly more work to absorb this initial impact stress in the forces of the throw compared to these high slot throws where the shoulder is resisting doing this work. 22% less work done by the shoulder here. So now as we get into the elbow deceleration of elbow extension velocity, we have another 21.6% longer that we're spending in deceleration. So that's going to be the stress of the elbow extension here, the tricep tendons, everything else. It's another 5 or so milliseconds that we have here of the full width half moment. So when we look at elbow extension, again, the half moment, full width, longer duration of actually going into elbow extension. So we have the varus loading rate. So the rate at which we load into valgus is going to be, we can also use a similar impulse graph right here, is if we're loading slowly, it would look like this. If we're loading fast, it would look like this. So we have the high slot throws that are painful. It's loading at 22,856 nanometers per second compared to the low slot throws at 67,047 nanometers per second. So it is 65.9% reduction in the varus loading rate, which is something that I was initially anticipating to be beneficial for these high slot throws, as I was assuming that the high velocity was going to be much more stressful on the joints. However, when we look at this and look for what the data is actually showing us, this does make a lot more sense when comparing it to these impulse graphs here, as there's less demand for varus, less demand for all these forearm musculature and produce varus as a resistance to the valgus stress that we have in the throw. So this longer duration is going to be more total cumulative stress compared to the low slot throw where it's a much sharper impulse curve, slower duration of actually having to produce varus. So when we compare varus to valgus and we look at the demands of all of these structures to absorb the torque that we create, we notice how the high slot throw has significantly more duration above these thresholds, which I had looked at with some of these graphs that I created here to show how when we just look at time only and just the duration above a threshold at 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100% thresholds, the time is definitely higher with the high slot throws, but it's going to be much closer compared to when we look at the full area where we have these impulse curve graphs again. And we're not just looking at the time, but we're looking at the force with the time, and the area is going to be what's most useful for us to actually look at how we can measure the cumulative stress and the demands of these structures to absorb the torque. So when we have this 50%, 60%, 40%, whatever the threshold is we'll use 50% right here. Not only what is the time, but what is the entire area of this right here. And then we have this right here, 100%, 50%, not just the time, again, because obviously B is higher, but what is the area? And comparing the area above each of these thresholds is where we actually get to really analyze what the structures are doing to stabilize the elbow and continuously produce this varus torque as we have longer durations of valgus loading on the medial elbow. So when we set our thresholds to 20, 40, 60, and 80%, that's what we have marked off right here. The ratio of the high slot to low slot continues to increase, as we kind of see over in the graphs here as well. But it goes from a 2.19, 2.23, 2.35, all the way up to 2.76. So when we're looking at the top end range, so at 80% or higher of this threshold here in our impulse graphs, and we're looking at this top 20%, there's almost 3 times the amount of total cumulative load in these high slot throws compared to the low slot throws. So the low slot throws, we're getting in and out of these very stressful positions when we experience this pain and the high demands for production of varus torque against the valgus loading. Again, using these driveline open biomechanics project right here, we see that even when just looking at the peak varus per mile per hour, nothing is actually going to explain more than 0.5 r squared. So 50% or less of the cumulative load that we're seeing here when we look at how much is actually being demanded for producing varus torque to offset this valgus loading, how much of this is produced or explained by just the peak varus torque, and it's less than half. So if you're only looking at what is the peak torque, we have 140 versus 126, this 14 nanometer gap, yes, it's definitely big, and it is explaining a significant chunk. We still have half the throw, half the loading on all these tissues that's completely unaccounted for. So this was the whole goal of the case study here and looking through this athlete, was to see how we can actually look to identify what the demand is of these structures, what is causing the pain, and diving a little bit deeper here, which I think we've done a great job of looking into some of these metrics and looking for a more definitive answer than just what is the peak torque. It's going to be what is the demand of these tissues, how are these tissues loaded, looking at the joint by joint and the expansion compression models here to explain some of the actual compensation patterns that we're seeing as well. So now that we have a full picture of what the cumulative load is of each of these structures, this is going to help us dive into some of the elbow eccentric loading of total pronation work done. So we see that the high slot throw is doing 0.98 joules of total deceleration pronation work compared to 2.33 joules with the low slot throw here. So nearly 60% less total work being done, which might be explained by not only this peak 140 newton meters of torque that we're seeing with the high slot throw, but also the duration and exposure to high-end cumulative loading of the structures. As we discussed earlier in the presentation, how the pronator along with the FCU, FDP, FDS muscles are all going to have to do a lot of work to stabilize the valgus loading and create the varus torque to offset and stabilize the joint. So by the end of the throw, these muscles have already been worked severely as much as they're able to handle. And by the end of the throw, the pronator specifically is where we're experiencing the pain with this athlete here in our case study. And the pronator isn't able to handle the work that's tasked of it, where we go back to the total pronation work. With the peak pronation metric here, we see that these impulse graph is going to be much sharper with the pain-free compared to the high slot. So there's a higher total demand for pronation, yet the pronator itself is doing significantly less work. This is going to have to go somewhere. This force, the energy, the stress is all not going to disappear. So if it's going to go somewhere else, it's going to go to the elbow joint itself. It's going to go towards gapping. So gapping is going to be something that is useful within throw to throw, but over a long period of time, we want to close that gap, minimize the gapping and the valgus carrying angle of the elbow. So we want to compress this elbow so we allow ourselves more room to be able to gap, because once we've gapped, you can't continue to gap further. We have to compress the elbow so we can then gap. We have structures here to kind of do this work here. So we have the pronator is going to be doing work to decelerate. The elbow is going to pull itself apart to decelerate. But also someone's going to go to the UCL. The UCL can only handle so much. The tendons themselves can only handle so much. So we want to minimize our exposure to this high cumulative load early in the throw, at least with athletes who are experiencing pain, to minimize the demands of the structures unnecessarily. With all this being said, however, we all want to contextualize pain from a biological standpoint. Pain is only neurological. Pain is not a tangible thing. You can't see pain. You don't see pain on a X-ray, an MRI, any of these imaging things that we can see, because pain is only governed in the brain. Pain is the perception of the brain realizing there's a threat of danger here. So we have to teach the brain it is safe within its current limits, which can come from things like strengthening the forearms to handle higher loads. It can come from things like finding new movement solutions to not load the structures that are insufficient to handle their current load. So this is going to come from movement variability. It's going to come from improving mechanics, but it can also come from things like cortex imbalances. So with everything we've gone throughout this presentation so far, I want to kind of look at a few solutions that I would have if this was a more determinate sample size where we had high velocity throwers and many pitchers compared to just one sample size of a pitcher who's throwing in the 70s. So very limited kind of takeaways here, but this is what my solutions would be given if this was a much higher sample size and we had the same results here. So taking a look at what the structures are actually responsible for and these maladaptation patterns, things that like GERD, where pitchers are getting glenohumeral external rotation, losing internal rotation of the shoulder joint. Posterior capsule, losing mobility, it tightens up. Cubital valgus, where we get the resting valgus position. We get the ulnohumeral gapping of the elbow joint. All of these are going to be things that are used to reduce the stresses of throwing and reduce the actual stress on these structures. However, they have to be reset. You can't just keep going more and more because you have nothing to give. You need something to give, which comes from resetting it after it's been used. So as we talked a little bit about, it's a little bit beyond the scope of this thread, but I do want to mention evaluating the cortexes of the brain for imbalances. So looking at the impulse curves that we've been mentioning a lot at the end of this thread here, looking for sharper impulses curves where a lot of the current recommendations are to stay away from the underload throws that might have a sharp impulse curve and a higher peak, where we're just looking at the peak varus torque of a 3-ounce versus a 5-ounce versus a 7-ounce throw, and we see what the impulse curve is going to look like, and we see a higher peak with a 3-ounce, especially compared to the velocity that we're throwing it at. It's going to be higher velocity, lighter weight. But this isn't going to be reflective of the actual strain of the tendons themselves, the UCL, the musculature. So what my recommendations here is going to be is don't shy away from letting the underloads fly. I feel like a lot of people inherently have a sort of governor that's in their mind when ripping overloads. We obviously aren't going to let a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old rip the blue plyo ball that weighs 1 pound or a pink plyo ball, whatever it may be, that's a lot heavier. We're not going to let them rip this because we know that they're unprepared. But why is this? Because if we're only looking at the velocity and the varus newton meters and the peak torque, it wouldn't make any sense here because it's going to be heavier implement, lower total peak torque. But when we look at the impulse curves are going to be much flatter, which are going to show a higher total duration of work being done. So this is why, if this finding from the case study here holds up, I would say that the underloads are the way to go, and these are going to be much safer on the arm compared to something with a slow and flat impulse curve like an overload. And then obviously, as with everything, movement variability is always going to be king. And especially on the low intent throwing days of if you're throwing the same way over and over and over and over, you're going to be fatiguing these same structures more and more and more. You have to let them recover. You're going to have to strengthen them, let them recover, be ready to throw again. Don't keep straining them the same way. Try throwing from different slots. Don't be afraid to mix it up. Doing the same thing over and over is going to lead to some of these overuse injuries that we're seeing and some demands for structures that are unable to handle them. So this is a huge deep dive into everything from the anatomy, the background of pain, what it is from a biological perspective, but also I think one of the deepest dives that we've gotten so far on the internet on arm pain and using some of the motion capture metrics that we have to explain why arm pain is happening, and then kind of corroborating this with a little bit of the Driveline open biomechanics databases that we have publicly available as well. Thank you for listening. Obviously, this is just my interpretation of the case study here, so I'd love to have conversations with anyone who's made it this far. Thank you for watching, and look forward to any conversations that we have building off of this.